Sejam bem-vindos às Álvaro Siza Talks 2019. A arquitetura faz parte, é um dos eixos da missão de Serralves, assim como é também a área da reflexão sobre vários temas importantes à nossa sociedade em que vivemos. Por outro lado, o nome da Álvaro Siza está há muito tempo ligado a Serralves, pela construção deste museu onde estamos, pela intervenção que fez na casa, pela recente autoria da Casa do Cinema Manuel de Oliveira, que abriu este ano. E, enfim, há muitos anos que Serralves dedica grande parte, já dedicou durante muitos momentos a programação, iniciativas à Álvaro Siza. Isso ficou ainda mais evidente desde que Álvaro Siza doou parte do seu arquivo. A partir daí temos de facto vindo a trabalhar a sua obra e temos debruçado uma atenção especial à sua obra. Já fizemos várias exposições, várias conferências, várias publicações à volta da obra de Álvaro Siza, incluindo a exposição, como todos sabemos, a exposição em disciplina que está neste momento no Museu. Por isso, neste contexto, estas conversas com periodicidade anual fazem para nós todo o sentido organizar e queremos, de facto, que continuem por muitos anos. A segunda edição das Álvaro Siza Talks, que hoje arranca, conta com vários importantes oradores, vários importantes nomes no painel de oradores. Agradeço a todos a participação e a sua disponibilidade. Agradeço também ao Comitê Científico destas conversas, desde logo ao Álvaro Siza Vieira, que faz parte do Comitê Científico. O Álvaro Siza esteve hoje mais cedo cá connosco, mas estava um pouco resfriado e não pôde ficar, infelizmente. Agradeço também às restantes pessoas no comitê, a Eduardo Souto Moura, que também está no estrangeiro hoje, mas que estará cá noutras sessões. A Farouk Derakshani, thank you very much, the director of the Aga Khan Prize for Architecture. Thank you very much for being part of our scientific committee of the talks, for being here, and also for the support you provide us, you give us in organizing these conferences. Também a Philippe Verne, o diretor do Museu de Arte Contemporânea de Serralves, e o Carlos Muro, curador adjunto da Arquitetura do Museu e comissário destas conferências. Por isso agradeço muitíssimo a todos pela organização destas talks. Termino com uma palavra de homenagem a Manuel Graça Dias, pelo entusiasmo e dedicação que sempre dedicou a esta iniciativa. O Manuel Graça Dias integrava o comitê científico destas conferências e a sua ausência será profundamente notada. Muito obrigada a todos pela vossa presença e espero que gostem destas conferências que vão decorrer aqui durante 4 dias. Muito obrigada.
Muito boa tarde e mais uma vez bem-vindos à segunda edição das Siza Talks. I'm going to speak in English today because we have several guests. We have Farouk Derakshani, we have Marina Tabassum that don't understand English, and I think as we will have translation to Portuguese, from Portuguese to English and from English to Portuguese, we will take advantage of that. So, good evening, everyone, again, and welcome to the second edition of the Álvaro Siza Talks. I just wanted to say a few words to introduce the event. Over the years, the Serralves Museum has had a strong commitment to architecture. The first proof is that Álvaro Siza was commissioned the main building of the museum. But over the years, the museum has also presented a number of exhibitions and held many events, lectures, symposia, seminars around the field of architecture. As part of its commitment to architecture and following, as Anna Pinho just said, following the donation of part of Siza's archive to the Serralves Foundation, the museum decided to establish an annual event in his honor that aims at bringing together architects, scholars, students, and the general public for the discussion of issues relevant to contemporary architecture. That's something which is also important, actually, the means or the main aim is really to raise a wide discussion of contemporary architecture in connection to values and themes that are present in Siza's work. I am particularly happy to introduce this second edition of the talks. As a second edition speaks of continuity, and that's actually very important for us. I think it's relatively easy to organize an event, but it's not so easy to think of the continuity of something that has some consistency and has some sort of plans for the future. We are still in the making. Of course, this is not a project that came out finished. It's something which is in the making, and that's why we'll talk about it later again. We have a scientific committee that's kind of actively discussing, and we definitely hope that in the future we'll be even more actively trying to help shape this program. I just wanted to insist on the fact that the main aim of the event is the creation and exchange of architectural knowledge, and that each edition is centered around a specific topic in order to foster debate and discussion around architecture, as I was saying before, also in connection to themes and values contained in Álvaro Siza's work. So let me start. I just will show a few slides as a reminder, and I just to start. In the first edition, this is last year's edition, the title was Conversations with History. I would like to highlight a couple of things. The first thing is to do with the notion of conversation, which is very important. These are conversations on architecture. The notion of conversation as a form of knowledge, and a form of knowledge that I believe is very specific in a sense and very suitable to the world of architecture in many different ways. We perhaps are sometimes almost abusing this word because I really sincerely believe in it. And the other thing is history, and the understanding of history in a sense that would be the history of architecture as a history of shared problems for architects, not the way historians do sometimes look at it, but the way architects try to research it. History in many forms has been, of course, extremely important in the work of Siza. You can trace many influences, always very mixed with lots of other things. And we wanted to see how the history of architecture informs the work of the most interesting contemporary architects, and that's almost even more important, how the work of contemporary architects gives us a new reading of history. The speakers last year, we were quite fortunate to have Kazuyo Sejima as a main keynote speaker. We also had two architectural historians, Guido Beltramini and Giuseppe Ketlas. Guido Beltramini is the director of the Andrea Palladio Center in Vicenza, and Giuseppe Ketlas was a professor at the School of Architecture in Barcelona. He was my teacher, and arguably is the best architectural historian alive. And then Nuno Brandão Costa and Inés Lobo, two Portuguese architects from a similar generation, one based in Porto and one based in Lisbon, that actually completed a different approach and another generation and another context to the talks. This year we proposed this notion of conversations with matter. And architecture is both a conceptual and a material practice. So this year's edition tries to explore the importance of matter, materials and materiality, as well as the process of materialization of an architectural work. In a sense, would be also interested, and we translated that to some of the guests, to discuss this process, to discuss what Robin Evans used to call the translations from drawing to building. So how things are passed from one way to another, that sometimes, and we were having a discussion earlier on today. That would be also one of the things that many regulations and many institutions and many forms of practice, particularly in the Western world, are trying to separate construction from the design process. And we try to also insist that the materialization of architecture is part of the design process. It's an integral part and a unique part of it. So I just wanted to very briefly, I'm not going to lecture, we're here to listen to Marina Tabassum later. There was an important writing by Álvaro Siza on materials that he did for a publication for the exhibition he held at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University in 1988 that was curated by Wilfred Wang. And in this text, he does a reflection, and the first couple of sentences actually, He says, I scarcely know which materials to choose. Ideas come to me immaterially, lines on white paper. When I want to fix them, I have doubts and they escape, waiting in the distance. I think in a sense, there's several ideas here which I think are important. To start with the very notion of doubt, which is not something negative, but something very, very important, and how Siza's architecture has always been apparently born in material, but then, and that's what I think is really relevant also about his work and the process of materialization. Once a decision about material is made, then there's an incredible consistency, and all the decisions follow in a very interesting way. I think that's a very important. Of course, there's this kind of poetic things that when you want to fix ideas, they escape and they wait in the distance, but they wait. And I was discussing with some students before the fact that Siza has had an incredible tenacity, an incredible continuity in his work, and actually the materialization process has to do with that. Just one more word about materials before we present this year's program fully. I recently came across a series of 23 points that Ferran Adrià, arguably also the best, I don't know what to call him, cook, that falls short, but the person who has transformed cooking and food in the last quarter of 20th century. And he prepared almost like a manifesto of these 23 points for a meeting in Madrid Fusion. It was a very important meeting gathering cooks and people around gastronomy. And he had this, I think this is the third point, which is very important to me. It says all products have the same culinary value regardless of their price. And then in order to explain that, he asked the audience, well, what is more valuable, a potato or a lobster? And of course, then he argued that they were equally valuable in principle, but if he were to choose, he would choose the potato, because there's so many ways to prepare a potato. But in the end, that the ingredients have the value that the cook, the person who transformed them, is able to give. I was thinking immediately that if you replace products for materials, you could say exactly the same about architecture in terms of its materiality. So all materials have exactly the same architectural value, regardless of their price. So a material, what is more valuable, a very precious marble, steel, or a simple brick of the poorest type of clay? Well, in principle, they all have the same value in the hands of the architect. I think that's partly what we'll be seeing in some of these presentations these next few days, and I think that's something that we should reflect about. Just to introduce very briefly this year's program. Today we had Anne Lacaton. Anne Lacaton is not going to be here with us today. I think that was announced already on the website. Anne Lacaton is sick, and she's very sorry because she was very, very much looking forward to being here. We hope that we'll be able to bring her soon. And we'll move Marina Tabassum from Dhaka, from Bangladesh, and she will give the first talk. We will keep the time for Manel Eres Mateus at 9:30, so there will be a slightly longer break. We'll come back to that in a minute. Well, I've been asked to make a couple of announcements before I forget, because I'm very bad at advertising things. So the first one is that the bar, the coffee shop and the bar are going to be open during the break, so that anyone who wants to stay here and wait for Manel's lecture can grab some food there. And the other thing is that the exhibition the Álvaro Siza exhibition, the Indiscipline, will be also open, and it's free to access for all of those who bought a ticket for this event, for these lectures. Tomorrow we will have Roger Tudor from Arquitetos from Barcelona, and later Iñaki Ábalos and Renata Sienkiewicz from Ábalos and Sienkiewicz from Madrid. On Friday, Mark Lee from Johnston Markley, will introduce them later, and Richard Sennett, the sociologist and probably one of the most important cultural figures of the last few decades. And also for reasons of agenda, we had to move Jacques Herzog's talk, which was initially planned to happen today, to next Tuesday, and that will be an event in itself. He will be on his own. Just a couple more reminders. As I was saying, there's the exhibition Álvaro Siza Indiscipline open in the galleries upstairs, so that if you have the time and you haven't seen them, I think it's a good opportunity to visit them. an exhibition curated by Nuno Grande and myself, with the strong, in conversation with Álvaro Siza. I think it's a critical approach to his work, but at the same time the work is presented in a very straightforward way, and I hope that you enjoy it. So remember that it will be open during the break. And that's also one of the reasons why we're having the talks at this time of the year, because I think it's very important that there's always something that confronts the activities, and it's very important that we have the exhibition open, and that's an incredible support for the talks, and the other way around, that's part of the activities. I'm not going to discuss that. Once again, I didn't want to finish without remembering Manuel Grasadias. As Ana Pinho was also mentioning before, the Siza Talks has a scientific committee. The scientific committee was originally formed by Álvaro Siza, Eduardo Soto de Moura, Manuel Grasadias, Farrokh Darkhshani, and myself, and Susan Cotta, the director of the Serralves Museum at the time. And now Manuel Grasadias has left us, and Philippe Berg has joined us, and we'll probably join some new members in the near future. But it's very important to have this backing. Manuel Grasadias is very much missed. I just wanted to remember him, a very important architect and critic and educator that actually also, in my view, was one of the few bridges between Porto and Lisbon during many years, and I think that his work will be very, and his voice will be very missed. So just a memory for him. As I was saying, we have a strong advisory board, a strong scientific committee. Today we have the pleasure to have Marina Tabassum, which I had the pleasure to meet personally last year, and I very much respect her work, and I'm very much looking forward to that. I'm very happy to have her. But I will let Farrokh Darkhshani, director of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, introduce her. And also I think on Tuesday, Eduardo Soto de Moura will be introducing Jack Herzog, and I think that's also important to not to save me some work. On the contrary, it's in order to involve the scientific committee in these events, which I think it's part of the generosity with which they have always approached. So join me in welcoming Farrokh Darkhshani, who will be introducing Marina. Thank you so much.
Bom dia. I just wanted to say, I'm not going to say Marina was born such and such date, what she did. I mean, those are details. You can all go on Wikipedia, wherever you can find those. It's always very boring when you hear the same thing coming again and again and again, especially for the speaker. What I wanted to say is that I just was thinking as a relationship that where Marina's coming and Portugal. Besides Bangladesh, Marina is from Bangladesh and Porto. There's one thing in common historically. There, usually, especially the Portuguese, they love to say that they've been everywhere, they've made all connections in the world, etc. That is correct. But what I'm saying is that there are two countries which each of them in the region are smaller than their neighbors. They're smaller countries. They've got a population. And in certain, especially in the past 50 years, they were not as rich as their neighbors. However, the two countries have done something very exceptional. They have had a contemporary architecture which is very marked. Within Europe, Portuguese contemporary architecture of Portugal is something which is very specific. It's known. I mean, not because of only Álvaro Siza and Eduardo, but a big group of architects here have produced architecture which you don't find it in the other countries as such, as it has an identity. The same thing happened in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, which it was historically a very old country, but after the British decolonization from the Brits, the country was in two, the East and West Pakistan. So the East Pakistan, that's how the British people like to make the countries, East and West. But Bangladesh became a country in only 1971. So it's a very young country. But this young country, in order to make the nation, they had some visionary people there who put a lot of emphasis on architecture. And especially before that Bangladesh became a country, in Pakistan they got famous architects. They were asking India, same thing. Le Corbusier went to India, and Louis Kahn was commissioned to do the parliament of the East Pakistan, which was later became Bangladesh. So he went there. And he was an architect, and there was a local architect, name of Mazhar al-Islam, that he was a very key person. He was the one who also brought other architects. Paul Rudolph went there, many people went to Bangladesh and started working. But by this Mazhar al-Islam, he started with discussions and involving the younger architects, they were the first schools of architecture, brought together a kind of an identity, an understanding. It was not a pastiche of making repetition of what is been built, but it was a new language which was done. Some of that was the heritage of Louis Kahn's presence and his mastery in architecture, but at the same time in the research, in discussions. They had a group called Chetana, for example, that they were discussing these things among themselves. And they had a big influence also on the schools of architecture. There is an exhibition has been going around in Europe. It was first in Basel and then now in Frankfurt, called Bengal Stream, which has been, and there's a book has been published. And what is interesting is that you're not looking at 1, 2 architects who are very famous have gone something through. It's a number of architects who've done a number of interesting projects, which all of them have got deep roots in their traditions, but they're very specific. Although they're specific to the country, but they speak of an international language. And that is very interesting. So Marina Tabassum is one of the second generation, let's call them, architects of Bangladesh, and she has got a number of projects in the same exhibition. And also there's one other thing in which you go when you compare the West and the East, there's a lot of architects who are known in their countries. They go and get their educations from Ivy League schools, other parts of the world, and they go back home to work. So they're trying to translate what they have learned into their countries or just copy. And actually, that was what has the most horrible things which happened in many developing countries, that they wanted, people studied, or foreign architects wanted to just bring whatever they've learned and just implement it there, which doesn't work. So Marina went to university in Dhaka. She went to high school, university, born there, and in 19. Now I have to just drop some dates for this because it's important. So in 1994 she finished school. In 95 she started an office with a partner, Kashif Chaudhry, called Urbana, and they did a series of very interesting projects together for 10 years. And then she started her own office called MTBA, Marina Tabassum Architects, and she's been working on her own. Marina's, if one can talk about them, she's going to show her projects. I'm not going to talk about what she's done. But there are certain things which are very important in her work. First of all, that she has been working a lot with light. You can see the importance of light in her projects. When she's going to make the presentations, please make notice of that. And that is an understanding in architecture. Light doesn't mean that it's which country where. How you deal with light in architecture is one of the most important ways that architects can work. Here in this building, when you're working during the daytime, you can see that how the light in different parts, what role it has. The second is about materiality, of course. Well, Bangladesh is a country of brick. That's how they don't have, there's a whole history why they have brick. Maybe she will explain that because they don't have stone. When you don't have stone, you have to build with something. And that's how the brick became the main building material in Bangladesh. Just again, when she's presenting her projects, you will see that the density is the most dense country in the world. 150 million people live in the delta, where half of the country is moving because of the rivers, the movement of rivers. It's a very weird situation. It's not like here in your country. The other thing is that she has become, after some years of work, has started research in very different areas. She has not limited herself into just repeating an architecture, getting to the form, some materials, and just implementing that like, stamps that they put it. So she's got a very, as I say, very complex group of projects that she's worked on, and also she's been involved in research. She's been teaching at the university, the BRAC University in Bangladesh, but also this year she's been at Harvard. She's been teaching last year at Harvard. She has a studio there, and she's also, there is a very interesting institute in Bangladesh now called the Bengal Institute, which is a school of architecture, but they're doing more research on architecture. So this is about Maria, but why she is here also is that I very feel sometimes kind of, because of my age, to all the people who won an Alcon Award for architecture. So she won an Alcon Award for architecture for her project that she's done in the mosque. And I feel very responsible to make sure that she's going to be doing better and better. Sometimes I tell her, Marina, please don't accept these invitations to go and give lectures here and there, etc. She was here. She was in Porto 2 years ago, I think. She had the Casa de Arquitetura, and she was in Lisbon. So I said, listen, be careful. Don't do it. Just because you're going to be, there's such a demand on her that every single person, they call me, they think that I'm her agent. She called me to get her to different places. So now I welcome Marina Tabassum.
Thank you, Farouk. Thank you all for being here today. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I've been traveling quite a lot, which is not something I'm enjoying these days anymore. I really need to reduce, definitely, and I'm trying to reduce. I mean, I don't know, in my office every single day, we get so many invitations to go and give talks, and, it's just overwhelming. But I'm really happy to be back here in Porto. Thank you, Carlos, for inviting me. And obviously, I accepted this definitely for the very reason that it was a Álvaro Siza talk. Let's see. So basically, I would like to begin as Farouk mentioned that I do come from Bangladesh. I was born there, raised there. I went to school there. I did my architecture in Bangladesh as well. So, and the school was very much based on the curriculum of the West, in a way, an American curriculum. But I think I was exposed to a lot of books at that time, and Siza, I don't know, for some reason, I would say probably a karma or a confession I would have to make in the very beginning, which is about this very building where we are in, this museum, which I saw images of that in a book which was there in our library in the early 90s. And I absolutely fell in love with the images that was there. So the very first project I ever designed right after graduating from school, and this project I rarely show in any of my talks, but I think it would be interesting to share with you. My very first building that was built in 1995, right after my graduation, my aunt's house, by the way, and I was freshly graduated, and she, me being the only architect in the family, she asked me if I would be interested in designing her house. And obviously, that's what you want to do. And I was still under the spell of Siza in many ways. So that's, to some extent, my interpretation of what I understood. I was still very fresh. And you can probably, it's not Siza, definitely not. I'm not saying that I'm anywhere near his excellence, but the fact that there was still an influence or inspiration, and I kind of was heavily influenced by that. And in many ways, this project is a sort of a confession that I did try to copy or maybe get inspired by it. But yeah, it's a small family residence, and so that was my beginning in many ways. And I think it's interesting to be able to come and share this here, which is quite interesting. But after that, I think I have been able to go beyond that and sort of try to find my own understanding in architecture. And so basically here you see what I try to focus on, and I've sort of tried to bring together, is three most important elements that I focus on: place, time, and context. And place defines our uniqueness, who we are as people, gives us our identity. And time actually updates the socio-cultural atmosphere that is constantly changing. And context is basically time-place matrix. That's how I envision it. And so basically, every time I try to work on a project, my first understanding is to go through these three aspects. So to start with place, where I come from, as you see, Bangladesh. And if I can show you, you see that these are the rivers. This is the Himalayan range. And south of the Himalaya foothills, there are three really major rivers. One is the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Meghna, and all these three rivers combining, flowing into the Bay of Bengal. And these areas are all built up by the silt that was brought in from the Himalayas. So it was over time that these lands have grown, and these are absolutely flat delta, very soft and fragile. And these are really mighty rivers. So 2/3 of Bangladesh is actually delta. And now if you see here the images, these are the satellite images from 1971 till date. You see how the rivers move. And as the rivers move from a satellite image, you see the land erosion, and then there is also new land coming up. So this is a very fluid kind of a landscape. So there is no difference in some ways between water and land, the way it moves. And if you go very close to it, this is what you see. On one side, you see how the river is eroding the land, which is very soft. And on the other side here, you see new land that are emerging in the land, within the river. So, many small towns have vanished into the water because as the water moves or the river changes its course. So it's this erosion and emerging of new land that is a very common criteria, especially in the delta area. And for Sharjah Triennial, I'll start with a research project, basically. For Sharjah Triennial, we were asked to sort of look into this area where a new land comes up. And if you see the new land here, it's a very fresh new land that has emerged last year. So it's still a very sandy land. And after maybe 8 years of its existence, then people start to inhabit it. So it has its own ecology. Our idea for the Sharjah Triennial, which is now going on in Sharjah, the idea is to look into the rights of future generation. And we kind of looked into the rights of the generation who are living in these areas. So the first was to understand the land and to sort of to see what it is all about. So you can really cannot distinguish between what is water and what is land. So if you see here in this image, this is the area where we are focusing on, that area over there. This part of Bangladesh is still a very active delta. Active meaning that it's constantly moving, whereas these parts are much more matured delta, so it doesn't move anymore, but these areas are very much moving. So we focused on an area which is right there. And in terms of architecture, basically what you see is these are the kind of houses you find, especially all along that belt where these movements occur, where land erosion happens. Why this kind of house form? That's because it is easily built within 7 days, and you can take it down within 2 to 3 hours. So it's like a packed, you can just buy it and raise it somewhere, and when you see a crack in the landscape, you immediately take your building down, take it to a much more safer location. So this house form has been there along this belt where these movements have happened, and which is kind of really interesting. So you see here all the different parts. So there is a structure which is wooden, and then there are some fillars. In old times it was wood, now it's corrugated sheet. And so every component is there. You can just take your building down, put it somewhere on a boat or a cart or a van, and move it to a safer location where you can re-erect it. And we found houses which have moved from many different locations. So, and these houses are passed on from one generation to the next generation, which is quite interesting because, generally what happens is a grandfather would make a house or buy a house and pass it on to the next generation of his grandchildren. And so we found houses which are like 50, 60 years old, 100 years old, and has moved 7, 8 different locations in its lifetime. So we've had some of the houses, so basically moving from one here to here to here. So these are all these different interesting facts. And there are markets where you can buy these houses. So this is one of those marketplaces where they make the houses, and you can go and buy them. And or even order it as a custom housing. So these days we hear IKEA making these flat pack houses, which actually existed in Bangladesh for more than 100 years. And using very simple tools, really, nothing that you find. The other thing that we found very interesting in this research work, while digging deeper, is what about the rights of the generations? Because when the river moves, your land goes away. So what happens? Basically, in old times, let's say more than 100 years ago, people just accepted the fact that, okay, land was there, they used it for agriculture, for cattle grazing, or even for fishing. But when the land would go away, they would forget about it. But it was during the colonial time, the British colonial time, when for the first time ever, these lands were turned into registered documents. So there was something called the Bengal Tendency Act, and under the act, there was this cadastral survey that was done, and according to that, these drawings were produced. And you can see all the different lines. These are actually marks of ownership. And these lands, which definitely was not owned by anybody, became the company, East India Company's own land, and they started leasing it out to the locals. So in the beginning it was a lease. Later on, these lands were sold to the people, and people bought it. And you can see all the documents up there. So that's the lease document, that's the auction document, and then later on it was passed on to the next generation. But if you take this drawing and put it in a context of a context which is now present, the land doesn't exist. It's in the water. So you basically, you have a paper, but you don't have a land. So that's the situation. So what happens is people wait with their papers, they wait for the land to return, and at times land do return. As the movements happen, land comes back. And when the land comes back, they basically go and claim it, and there are process of claiming the land. And when there is none, they just basically keep hoping that it will return back. And so the history of the land goes on orally from one generation to the next generation, so you never know when it will return. So it could be 2, 3 different generations later, all of a sudden it re-emerges. And when it does re-emerge, that oral history actually helps them to relocate it. So that's quite an interesting thing. So at the end, what we did, according to our research, is that these kind of lines in a place like Bangladesh, where these lands cannot be actually called land in that sense, we're kind of trying to, I find this quite interesting in Dilip Da Cunha and Anuradha Mathur's talk, where they talk about the fact that these are all wetness, and the line that we draw between water and land is actually a line which is drawn by design. And when you draw a line between water and land, you're basically separating the territory. And so when water comes or water goes beyond that line, we call it flood. But in reality, it's the water's right to be there. So that line, which is drawn by human, is actually denying water's right to be in a certain location. So that is what I find quite interesting, and that is so much very valid in Bangladesh context. So with all these different research work, which we did in almost 6 months, we took it all to Sharjah, and we decided to take 3 of these houses. I mean, if it can relocate from one place to other, it can go from one country to another. So in Sharjah, we put up these houses. We bought them in the local market. Here you can see, this is a courtyard we were given in Sharjah, and still there. If anybody is going to Dubai, please do drop in. So it's a school which was built in the 80s, abandoned, was supposed to be abolished, but they kept it and turned it into a venue for the triennial. And so what we did is these are the old house form, which is in the landscape in Bangladesh. And you can see how they sort of grow in the family. This is probably the oldest house they had, and then they added on. We just took one of the similar kind of house, and we just did a bit of a change, trying to pivot the facade. So, and all our research is basically inside these houses. So that's a single story. This is a 2-story house. And these are, we just created a courtyard and placed them in that area. And you can see our research hanging there in the space. And what we like about these houses is also the fact that this has this interesting decoration, which are actually drip courses where the water actually falls down, and these little decoration actually helps the water to go down straight. And what is interesting is the fact that these houses are born out of a need which is quite difficult, because you have to move from one location to other. But that doesn't mean that you are devoid of aspiration and desire. And that's why I think the decorations are quite nice and represents a certain kind of value and quality of life. So, and coming back to Bangladesh's landscape, you can see how beautiful it is. And this is towards the south. This is the Bay of Bengal. This is the mangrove forest, Sundarban, where the Royal Bengal tigers are located. And these areas right above it is very much the mature delta I talked about. So one of our project, which is Panigram Resort, since I am more in the outskirts, I thought we should probably place these projects together. So it's a resort project which we designed here. This area, the delta, is actually a very fertile ground, very green. There are 3 crops, 4 crops a year that happen. So basically, the entire Bangladesh is fed by these deltas in terms of food. So all the agricultural land you can see around here, our site is actually this area. So this is one of the very nice, beautiful river. And there's another one right going through there. So this is the site we were given. And you can see it's very green, some villages which are around these areas. But in our site, there was no village, but there was quite a lot of trees. And it's very green, it's very beautiful and scenic in a way, very flat, because it's delta. And so that's our site right there. And that's the river. And from our site, this is the kind of view you get, a bridge across. Again, paddy fields, and the landscape basically changes during different seasons, depending on what kind of crops are growing. So during the winter season, you see these mustard plantations, which are very beautifully yellow. And the agriculture scene is still very, very natural in many ways. This is like cow carts, so if you go in the morning, you'll see there's a traffic jam of cow carts going to the field to do their work. So in a site which is so very virgin in a way, there is no technology anywhere around, to go there and to build something, that became quite a challenge for me when I started this project or went to visit the site. And I, being born in a city, grew up in a city, to go to this kind of a very pristine, serene landscape, and to think that as an architect you want to put your mark there, what should it be? And that was a sort of a challenge, because the way I was taught architecture, I definitely did not have the ability to do anything there, really. Anything I would put there would disturb the beautiful dynamics that exist in the land. So that became a challenge. So during my first site visit, this was the quote I kind of wrote down, that rural Bangladesh is uniquely beautiful, soul of the delta land. It feels like a crime to invade this silence with the roaring noise of architecture. So as we generally do, and in any architecture project, we go through a bit of a research work before we even start drawing anything. We started looking into the land and the landscape and how people built there. So if you look deeper, you'll see that that's kind of the section that they draw. It's actually a flat land. What they do is they dig a pond first, like the ponds that you see here. These are not natural, these are man-made, or like here. So they dig a pond, they take the earth out, create a mound which is much higher. So sort of creating a small landscape feature. It's in a way the same thing that Louis Kahn had done in our parliament, because that's also a very flat, marshy land, and he dug a huge pond, took the earth, created a large mound, and on which he put the building. So in many ways, it's a much larger scale. Here it's in a much smaller scale, where you see that they create a mound, and on top of that, they build their houses. So these are the homesteads which are in a higher ground, and these are the ponds where the water then comes in. So it's a very simple landscape act which actually starts the whole architecture process. And as Farouk just mentioned, that we don't have any material, which is very true, we only have earth. So earth has been used for construction for as long as people have lived there. So these are the mud houses that you find with thatch. And we basically did a very extensive documentation of all the villages, some of the villages that are around the site. And so these are the basic program of a household, if you break it down. So there are houses, toilet, kitchen, granary, and then you have clothes drying hangers, chicken, and then water, everything. These are basically all the different elements that what we architects call a program. And then you just take the programs and you put them all around a courtyard. So all these different elements then create a courtyard. And this courtyard is not distinctly defined, but kind of very loose. And one courtyard is connected to the next courtyard and the next courtyard. So it's a very social, communal way of living. And so one person can go from one courtyard to the next house's courtyard, and then so it's a very I would say a very communal way of living, and also living more with the nature in a very symbiotic relationship in many ways. And that's how the entire village grows. And here you see in the drawing, this is a potter's community. So these are the courtyards of each houses, and the potters basically need a large squarish courtyard to dry their pottery. And so this is one of their houses. That's Nimai Pal's house. So we became very close to the local villagers while we were doing these research works. This is one of the weavers' communities, villages, and you can see the weavers' community generally have a very linear courtyard because they work with bamboo and they require linear space. So that's the bamboo community. And so that's one of the bamboo weavers' houses. And for this project, what we tried to look into is also in the Bengal landscape, this was a very unique roof form, which is known as the Bangla Roof. And the word Banglo comes from this very word, which was taken by the British, then everywhere around the world. So that's the actual form of the Bangla Roof. And that was also taken by the Mughals. And you can also find some of the temple architecture takes that similar form. These are the different textures that we found. So these are basically the ingredients of what we tried to then take and use in our own architecture. So that's the site. That's the only road access. So we put our back of house facilities here. We decided to bring the guests from here to the tip. So this is where we would have the reception, and the rest of the bungalows were generally placed there. Initially, my idea, which was very architectonic in a way, creating a small lake and then putting some bungalows here, and then creating some visual accesses, and then very hard formal approach. Later on, once we did the study of the villages, turned into something very much like that, where we still have the visual axis, we have the water feature, but we tried to sort of spread it out in a more courtyard formation. These are the different bungalow types, and the way we decided to build these are thick mud brick walls, because that's the construction technique there. So we used mud, 30 inches. We're still on inches and feet, sorry about that. But so really thick wall made out of mud and earth, and basically bamboo and wood. So these are the different huts you can enjoy in different places. These are 2 bungalows, some are single bungalows, so we did that. So there's a toilet facility and the living and dining space. And the other thing what we did is, since we were so becoming connected to the villagers, what we decided is that we should also encourage the younger generation to come and work with us. And so he's one of those from the potter's village, a young boy or a young man who has studied in school, never learned the skills of pottery because pottery doesn't earn enough money, so they're not skilled in that anymore. But that's his landscape actually, you can see his family. And that's his grandfather who actually has the skill of building it. So what we did is we created a connection between him, and here he is. And we had product designers coming in and sort of working with the entire team and the locals to create these product diversification workshops, so where they can also create certain things which would then help. So basically what we did is we engaged the locals. This is our construction technique. As you can see, we use mud brick, mud mortar, and wooden rafters, basically. And so the villagers came and started building the project. So it's a process where we decided to have this idea of co-creation, where the villagers helped us build it, and we just did the master planning. The rest of it is done by the villagers. Here you see this roof technique, and this is a technique which you don't find anymore because people don't build in the same way. So we only found 2 groups of people who still have the same skill of weaving this thatch onto the roof. And so we basically hired them and did that. Women are also working, and they do really wonderful plasters. So mud plaster, in fact, locally is all done by women. So women are also employed in the project. So this is one of the huts. You can see that the roof form is quite, has a presence of its own. That's the, I would say, the elevation from the riverside. So you see the small bungalows. I cannot claim any credit for these bungalows, really. It's all the locals who built it, the entire roof system and everything. It's just we being present as managers and doing the master plan and all the, the technical requirements that are required for a bungalow. But otherwise, the entire project is very much built by the locals. So in a way, it was a social and environmentally responsible project. That's what was initially briefed by our client. These are the mud potteries that the locals make there in the pottery village. And while doing this project, we also, as I was mentioning, that we worked with the villagers, we created these craft diversification workshops. As you can see, they are working with different kind of craft, which are, of course, their own skill. We created these savings groups where women every week save a certain amount of money, and now they have quite a good amount of money where they can now loan themselves to build houses. So they have this scheme where the community themselves are loaning them one of their members to build house. And to start that process, we also did the mapping of the community. So all the maps that I showed you are actually drawn by the locals or the villagers. So they did their own mapping of the village. And this is one of the projects which is close to the site, $1,500 home projects, where it's the same process that was followed. They make an aspirational model, and then finally the architects actually help them manage the fund that they have to buy the material. And so this is one of the $1,500 home that is there, you can see. So for my studio at Harvard GSD, I gave my students the same task of designing a $2,000 home. And $2,000 for a student at Harvard is not a lot of money. But for a Bangladeshi villager, it is a life's savings. And for a villager, it's 3 cows and a goat. That's the calculation. So my students actually visited the site. They went and visited these $1,500 home. And this is the architect, Hasibul Kobir, who's actually responsible for doing these projects. And the students took part in a hands-on workshop, understanding the material that are locally there. They also talked to the clients. So we have 5 different clients which were chosen by the community themselves, whose houses will be built. And so they basically talked to them, made models, and then finally, after the finishing of the studio work, there was a small exhibition in the village where the clients also had to look at the houses, and based on their own choice, we chose 5 different projects to be built on site. So this is, again, another group of students sitting with the client. Here's the review, and that's the client with her building design. So some of the projects were chosen to be built on site. This is one, this is another one. And the students had to actually prove that it is buildable in $2,000. So they had to really go through a lot of calculation. And for the first time in my life, I've heard a GSD student say, "Oh, that's too much expense, $100, oh my God." So they could really understand the value of $100 by designing. So this is a studio report that was produced by GSD. And the same project, in a way, the research that we did, we took it also to the Venice Biennale in the last one, in 2018, where we were given a space in the Arsenale right here. That's our project. And we focused on the idea of wisdom of the land. And in many ways, that was what my lesson was, that there is so much of wisdom in the land. And if we don't look at it, if we don't learn from it, as architects, we lose that connection. We don't really know it. We don't really learn it through a formal education that we are taught in school. So I would think that that's a kind of a personal responsibility to learn about that. So wisdom of the land was our focus. What I found quite interesting in the brief was that they talked about going beyond the visual, choreographing the daily life. And so I thought choreographing daily life for me was a perfect interpretation of a Bengali courtyard. So we decided to create a courtyard. And so this is our wisdom triangle, where you see these days we are overflooded with information, but how we process, and then finally the wisdom comes. So we went from the north to south of Bangladesh. We sourced a lot of different elements, and these are the people who actually donated their own house, or things from their own houses, and things that they made themselves. So these are elements which are important in a daily life. Like these are the granaries, and this is the lady who made the granaries. So one of our granary is there, which is actually used for keeping grains to keep it dry. This is a grinder, as you can see, and people generally use it with the feet. Daybed, and then we had our pottery ladies making these small, nice potteries for us. So this is the site, and this is our plan for the biennial. And we created this courtyard of a Bengali hut, where the houses you don't see anymore, because the houses are basically done in steel lines, and then we have all the different elements of a courtyard. So the idea was to celebrate what human hand can build, and has been perfected over time. And so this was a mud floor, and you could just, I don't know, many of you probably have visited or not, but it was an interesting courtyard after that long walk through the Arsenale, and then you could probably just sit here for a while. And we really enjoyed bringing all this. Now this is all with the TU Berlin, so we donated this to TU Berlin. So coming back to Bangladesh, so that was my understanding of location in many ways, through projects, through research. Talking about climate, basically Bangladesh, that's Bangladesh, so Tropic of Cancer cuts through Bangladesh, making it a very subtropical climate. We have rain, like you have here, but yours is in the winter, ours is more in the summer, so we celebrate rain. We're really happy when you see rain coming down, because it's in a hot summer day, you really enjoy that. Our winter, so-called winter, it's hardly anything, really, but it's dry, and the temperature drops down. So the temperature basically is a kind of a moderate difference. The difference is not that great. So forever, this has been the architecture form, where you raise your building on a plinth to keep it dry, because we have rain, and then to cover it with a shade to keep yourself dry, or save yourself from the elements. And this is our first building, and as Farouk mentioned about Mazhar al-Islam, this is Mazhar al-Islam's first building, designed in 1952. And you can see that a very modern building in a way, because he studied in the US, came back to Bangladesh to practice architecture, and this is one of his first projects. But it's a very open building in a way, which has a great connection to the inside and outside, so there is hardly any boundary as such. And so porosity is very important for us because you need to be porous to let your facade be porous enough to allow ventilation to come through, because of the high humidity that we have during the summer months. It's always important that the building is constantly being ventilated and there is cross ventilation. So in many of our early projects, this is what we've had. Very open facade in a way, flexible, you can open it, close it, kind of blurring the edge, or not to have a very distinctly bounded edge, but to make it more operable and flexible. So this is one of the very first projects we did, which we call a Pavilion Apartment, where we try to have this idea of openness or being connected to the outside. And this is my courtyard where I grew up as a child, and in a way sort of depicting that as a courtyard later on in the project, where you can see it's open to sky, a small space, but very much connected. And if you close this door, it becomes a outdoor and indoor. You can distinctly define, but at the same time you can keep it open. So the way it works, this is the courtyard, which is as a high volume. And basically the high volume lets the air go up because of high pressure and low pressure, and then there is a draft that air flows into the spaces. And so there is a constant draft of air. You don't need any kind of mechanical means to ventilate the building. The building kind of remains ventilated by itself. So it really works. And that's the courtyard you see, and that's basically the section. And another building, which is a very small house, where we use this 9 square grid plan, which also has a smaller courtyard in the middle, courts on the sides, and again, it's the same place where we have this open connection. And you see here, that's the court, that's the building actually. Very tiny project, but this idea we've kind of took it through, and these are the small courts on the sides, the courts on the edges, and then that's the volume that raises up, creating that draft. So airflow has been an important part of the way I practice architecture. For me, the natural means have to be incorporated in a building. So these are some of the upper level where you can just use it like a pavilion. Another building where we use the same technique, where we also again have a 9 square grid. I find this is kind of a Vastu Shastra, which is very Indian in a way, where you have a central court or openness, and then you have the buildings placed surrounding it. So this was an embassy competition which we won, actually, French and German embassy together. And in that building, this is the building actually, according to the security reason, there had to be 25 meters setback from all sides. So then you are ending up with a very small footprint. And it's in Dhaka. We won first prize, but we didn't get to build it. It was built by a French architect later on. So that's the site. That's our main building in the middle. These are the different sections. So that's how it basically has. So that's the central court, and it opens on the edges to allow light into the space. Some of the lights here. So as I was mentioning about brick and material, if you see architecture of people, which is perishable in a way, are always built with material which are locally sourced and has a certain kind of impermanent quality, so you can re-erect, remake. But when it's architecture of power in many ways, like religion, culture, or political, it always requires a certain kind of permanence. And for that reason, you take earth, make it into brick, and create something. This is a monastery, a Buddhist monastery. We have a couple of Buddhist monasteries dotted all around Bangladesh, so this is one of those. But to show you this, we have like 1st century, 2nd century monasteries. So this is one of those. And so brick has been in our culture for a long time, and we have good brick masons. And all our construction is generally done with hand, so handmade quality is a very important factor for us. Everything is handmade. We rarely have any kind of construction which is using heavy technology. It's basically everything is done with hand. So there is this idea of imperfection that you find in architecture, which is very important for me because it's something we need to celebrate in many ways. So, and these people have been working with us for forever, and from the very beginning of my practice till now, they're all very connected to us. So it's almost like a family. And quite often, this is the kind of drawings we do on site. It doesn't matter how thick a book you present to the site. It's completely redundant. It's at the end, the connection between you and the people who are building it. That's what is more important. So drawings for us, the formal way of practicing with drawings quite often doesn't make much of a sense because the people who work on site do not read drawings. So it's quite often you have to be there on site talking to them directly. So it's a very personal connection also. So coming back to Dhaka, now much more focusing on the city area. So that's Dhaka. And you can see water on the side. So it's kind of surrounded by water. This is one of the rivers that runs down Buriganga, or the old Ganges. And on the top, we have another river, which is the Turag. This is the parliament complex designed by Louis Kahn. And so basically, as you can see, the pink areas are all densely built. The city has grown monstrously from, let's say, starting from the river bank during the Mughal times, then slowly growing, and then now it has even gone further down to the south because the north is already built up and it has almost come to the edge. The fastest growing city in the world. And in fact, Dhaka is about 300 square kilometer area. We have 20 million people living there. So it is one of the densest cities in the world. So you see informal, formal, all side by side in the same location in a very symbiotic way. The city would not thrive or would not be able to survive without the informal settlement that exists. So there is a lot of micro-urban activity that goes on. And so this is the city, very dense, very intense. And I was just saying that it's a miracle that the city actually works. So in a city as dense as that, the architects do not get a chance to design a luxury house or a small single-family residence. Quite often, all our buildings are stacks of floors, because you need to house a lot of people, and it is a developer's paradise in many ways because there's a lot of developer projects that goes on, and this is again one of my projects, which is my only project that I designed for a developer, because I do not work for developers. It's my personal choice in a way. But that's the site, and it is on the major spine of the city, actually. And this spine, which is from north to south, going all along from one river to the other, remains quite busy. And from north to south, it can take about 3 hours to move from one end to the other. So that intense traffic. And so a lot of people actually sit on the street in the jam. And so that site was a place where I was thinking, like, how do you address a building in a location like that? As I was mentioning that, porosity is important for me, so that's how I kind of tried to work with the facades on the edges to allow ventilation. And when you're sitting in a jam in Dhaka city, you have a facade where the idea for me was that it's a facade that belongs to the city, so it needs to be for the city and not for the dwellers, which are 20 families in that building. So basically, that was one of the buildings. That's a developer's perspective view, and that's what the building actually looks like. So that's one project that I've designed where we have stacks of floors. Another project which is right here, again, I'm talking about porosity, as I was mentioning. One thing that we don't have anymore in Bangladesh is these long verandas, which were absolutely, those are the verandas I grew up in. It looks very Portuguese, doesn't it, with these tiles? But the thing is, these are the kind of houses we had where most of our time was spent in the verandas. You would go to the rooms only to sleep at night. But you don't see these anymore. These are completely gone. That very aspect or this very typology is not there. So in one project, I got the chance or the opportunity to talk to the client. We decided to introduce these verandas again. So it was sort of a veranda that goes around the building, sort of creating a space where people can actually sit or walk around. So you have courtyards in the middle. So these are the courts which are helping the airflow. But at the same time, these verandas are kind of surrounding it. So that's the plan, where you have, it is at some points it's disconnected. In some floors it goes all along with having terraces. These are the courts we had open so that you can ventilate with the openings here. And so this is one of the projects that is now we are working on, has gone into the approval phase. And the client wants a lot of trees also, so we thought that this could be also the place where you can have some vegetation in the building, if you like. So this hopefully will be starting soon as construction. Going to the museum project, Farooq also mentioned about Bangladesh being a part of Pakistan at one point. So as you know, when the British rule was the British left, basically the entire subcontinent was divided into 3 parts. So 2 parts became Pakistan and the middle part remained India. And so as East Pakistan and West Pakistan, Bangladesh's existence was from 47 to 1971. And during that time, actually, this is, you can see one of the largest forced mass migration that happened in the 20th century, where India and Pakistan was divided based on religion. And the Hindus were going into India, and Muslims who were living in the Indian part went to Pakistan. So this was a huge exchange of people moving from one to the other, and my family is actually from the Indian part who had to move to the Bangladesh part almost in a overnight. So we also became kind of refugees in that sense. And so 1947 to 1971 was a time of kind of struggle, because though we had the same religion, but our culture is quite different. We speak different language. There's quite a lot of difference, and because of the differences, there was always a certain kind of clash, and at the end, the Bengalis wanted to be free, and so there was a war in 1971, very intense war from March to December, and within this time, finally, Bangladesh was in December free as a sovereign nation. So that's the history of Bangladesh's birth in many ways. With the loss of a lot of life. And in 1997, the government wanted to build a museum and a memorial, or I would say not really a memorial, it's a monument to the entire nation, for the nation, as an independence monument. And it was a national competition, and we were in the 2nd year of our practice, 27 years old. We participated in the competition and we won. And, for us at such a young age to get an opportunity like that was immense. So that's the site actually right here, as you can see. This is one of the last rare green parks that's left in the city. Otherwise, the entire city, as you can see, is densely built. So to place a museum in a park became quite a challenge for us. That was actually the only challenge in a way. But it makes sense to have that museum in that park because the park has a history. It used to be a horse racing ground during the British time. And during the Pakistan period, this is also where all kinds of political activities used to take place, so that made it relevant. And in December, this is where the Pakistan forces actually surrendered to the allied force of India and Bangladesh. So that made it very relevant as a site. But as I was mentioning, that these are some of the last green remaining in the city. So that's again one of the major green areas. So what we tried to do is we tried to limit the footprint of the entire program or the brief that was given to us to a plaza, and to leave the rest of the park, not to touch it in a way. So it's a minimal footprint, which is this, and we designed it as a plaza, and we added an elliptical walk around it and an amphitheater. This is an already existing children's park, so we had nothing to do with that. So we just connected this road and created that, basically. So this is our plan. The idea basically was just to create a long plaza where people can come and gather. It's very horizontal. Your eyes do not get obstructed by anything. So the entire idea of being in a park still remains. It has a reflecting pool all around it. So what we try to focus on is that idea that there is a duality in the whole birth of Bangladesh. Of course, you won, and it's a sovereign nation, so we will definitely celebrate, and the celebration is on the plaza. But at the same time, the sadness of loss of life and people who lost their lives to gain that freedom is to be remembered, which is beneath the ground into the museum. So freedom, dream, aspiration has a preferred direction, which is upwards. Anything that relates to happiness, tends to go infinite, upward direction, whereas memory, sadness is always urging the subterranean. So, we're taking it down into the ground. So that's the section. You can see that's the plaza on top. That's our tower. And the museum is going below grade. So we have a wall. You can go down. So that's the project. Actually, after built, that's a children's park already existing. We have all the green that's remaining. The project took us 16 years to finish, by the way. We finished it at the end in 2013. We started in 1998. So it's the political will, it's a politically motivated project. So, for different reasons, it got stopped, and again, it started. So that's how it is. So to just explain to you, maybe I'll just go a little bit again to the plan, maybe here. So the idea was that you climb up the steps. There are a couple of elements on the plaza. So that's the tower for the 7th March speech. This is a central void or a water feature where the water kind of draws into this hole in the middle, and at the end is the tower. And to go down, you have a wall through which you actually go down into the museum. And so that's basically the ramps you take down, audiovisual room, and then these are the spaces where the museum is used. And this is the central circular drum where the water is placed on top. So you go down into the space. It is about 25 feet below grade. So we try to bring in light as much as possible from the outside. Everything is printed on glass, and so it's the entire history is kind of depicting on glass. And then you go through this dark space, which is a kind of, we call it a black exhibit area, where we have images of the genocide and killing, and through which you go inside that space, which is the central rotunda, which has this water feature, which is the water from the top drawing into the space. The only opening is this one where the daylight comes in, so it basically becomes a very only lit by the daylight, and there is no display here. And then you slowly go up. So that's the ramp taking you up. And then finally you go to the plaza where you see the Tower of Light, we call it, because we thought that the best way of representing freedom or independence is through light. Light of hope. So we call it a Tower of Light. And for us, the material we used here was glass, because glass can hold light or create this refraction through which light could be held in a way. So the glass was not used as a sheet glass, but it was stacked one top of the other, as you can see here maybe. So these are just stacks of glass, and there's a space frame structure behind, and then it's cladded onto the surface. So at night, it's lit from outside, and because it's thick glass layer, it kind of holds the light. And on our 16th December, during the Victory Day celebration, you can see the amount of people who goes there. And that's where you see the stacks of the glass. And during a good sunny day, you get refraction of light. This is in the evening light. And so it's a tower of light, beacon of hope for a young nation. The very last project. Am I good with time? Okay, maybe 5 minutes? Okay. So that's my grandmother, and my grandmother commissioned me for this project. This is the mosque, actually. So she had a small piece of land. I mean, I wouldn't say small piece of land in a city of Dhaka, that's quite a large amount of land. But she gave a part of her land, donated it to build a mosque. And so, and it was a very ceremonially, she invited me for a cup of tea. I went to her place, and then she told me that, would you be interested in designing a mosque? I want to donate this piece of land. So she had all her drawings and everything. And so in a way, I took it very seriously as a responsibility that, okay, I will definitely be responsible for the project, or I will take it as a project. And that's my grandmother here. And so this is during our groundbreaking ceremony, which was in 2006 in September. And you can see that it's a very village-like atmosphere. Under a jackfruit tree, we basically gathered for a prayer and sort of declaring that this land will be given as a mosque. And you can see my grandmother there. The thing is, after that was September, and in December she passed away. And so for me, it became almost like a promise I made to her. So this project became a very personal project. So I became not only the architect, but also the builder, the fundraiser, everything, client. So if you see the site that's actually there in the blue dot, that's the absolute north end, or the end of Dhaka city towards the north. And during the time when she donated the land in 2006, these areas were very much not so much built, actually, but slowly over time, in the last 10 years, it has really been growing as a settlement, where in the periphery, much more lower income family and lower middle income families are buying small parcels of land. So basically, it's a place in transformation or transition. I also looked into the history of mosque to sort of begin my research. And if you see, these are basically what is available. So the mosque, according to Islam or in Quran, there is no prescription of what a mosque should be. So basically, all you need is the right direction towards Qibla or Mecca, and you need a leader who will lead the prayer, and there is a congregation. That's it, nothing else. This could be a mosque if you want, if you have the right direction, that's it. So basically, that's all that is required. So the actually mosque form during the Prophet's time developed from a house form. So the house was then elongated for a congregational space, and that's how it was used as a prayer hall. And it was not only used as only for the purpose of prayer or congregational prayer, but it was also a place where people generally gathered for communal social activities and also for different various kind of activities that took place in mosques. But it doesn't remain the same anymore these days. But as Islam grew, went to the north, went to east of the Arabian Peninsula and to the west of Arabian Peninsula, it has taken so many different forms, and it has basically, adapted to the local culture, the local climate, construction technique, material that is available. So you can see all different kind of mosques in the entire world. And these are the mosques that are there in our own landscape in Bangladesh. These are the Sultanate period mosques, the first time when Islam came into Bengal in the 14th century. And basically, again, same technique as the temples were built, let's say. It's just without decoration, and it has, to some extent, changed the typology, but otherwise it's the same technique of building with brick. And this is the kind of mosque we have now. No quality whatsoever in terms of how do you go inside and how do you pray, what do you pray, I don't know. I don't go to mosques because women in Bangladesh do not go to mosques. So, and this is what has happened to the symbols. So do you really need to identify yourself with a symbol like that to call it a mosque? Or you seek something else? So we basically decided that spirituality, in a way, where in a space where that would evoke a certain kind of spirituality, that should be our guiding factor. And so these are some of the spaces I absolutely love. As you know, this is the Cordoba, the Grand Mosque of Cordoba, Hagia Sophia, though it's not a mosque, a basilica, but even then the quality of light and the way the space and the atmosphere that it creates, the certain kind of spirituality that exists in these spaces were fascinating and inspiring for me. So I decided to go towards that path of looking into light. So the site is here, and this is the basic square, which is along the road, but the prayer hall, which is in the middle, needed a certain shift to have that connection with the Qibla or the Kaaba direction. So if you have the site and then you change the direction, you create these corners, which I was not happy with. So I introduced a circular volume, a kind of a drum, which then helped to facilitate this shift of 12 degrees. And so these are some of the sketches I did in the beginning. Coming from the old architecture, what we have, and then this became my conceptual drawing, where you see the prayer hall in the middle, and these sides became the open to sky courtyards. These are the ancillary facilities that exist, and so these are all brickwork, so it's an entirely brick wrap. So the idea was that the prayer hall would be more like a pavilion space, whereas it would be wrapped around with a brickwork. That's the plan, or model actually. So that's the drum. So if you insert the prayer hall in the middle, you get these open courtyards on the edges. So this is the brickwork. So it's basically a pavilion. That's how I see it. And the edges are very porous, so it allows the ventilation, which I was talking about earlier, that it's a kind of an obsession that a building must operate on its own without being dependent on any artificial means. So that's my plan. Actually, that's where you go up. This is a colonnaded entrance, but you're not allowed to enter directly to the mosque. You have to take a few bends, and that was intentional because once you take a few bends, you slowly get focused towards the act of praying. Or, that's the way you enter into a space. So direct entrance would not prepare you. So in a way, you have to make these few bends in a way to create a small journey to go into the prayer space at the end. Some of the drawings, sketches, I'll go fast, sections, the brick masons. This is the guy who got the Aga Khan Award, by the way, because the award actually celebrates not only the architect, but the entire team who has worked in the project, starting from the client to the masons and everybody who's involved in the project. So he got an award, or the sum of the, the award that we get, certificate and everything, and then he went off to Saudi Arabia. So he's not working with me anymore. So we use this porous brickwork, and this is the mosque in its own location. As you can see, a lot of building coming up, new construction. Some new constructions are, again, probably there more. So that's the project. And we tried to, whatever space we had, we tried to create some space where people can actually just go and sit and enjoy. The thing is, once the way it is, all these plots that you see with the demarcations, these will all be built up at some point in time, and you won't be able to see the mosque anymore. So in a way, the idea was not to look outside, but to look more within. And in a way, see here, new buildings coming up. So it will, at one point, you won't see anything from the sides, so it will be completely lost in terms of visually. That's why it was important for me to also look within the space. And here you see the interior and the outside. You see how harsh the light is, but once you're in, it is much more softer a light. So the light plays an important role in this building. My grandmother did leave the land and a small sum of money to start the project, but I had to raise fund from the locals, from everywhere, every source I could find. So it was a very modest budget, and so everything is very bare and simple and minimal. The only ornament probably in this space is the light. And so light, which is for free, you don't pay anything, but all you need is some nice details to work with. And then, you can get beautiful space, which is spiritual at the same time. So in a way, I also worked in a project at the Whitechapel Gallery. This is the last thing that I would show you. In an exhibition which is called the Is This Tomorrow? It's an exhibition which was done this year in February as a continuation of an exhibition which they held in Whitechapel Gallery in 1956, which was called This Is Tomorrow. So that was right after the war, a lot of promise that people felt. So this was a very seminal exhibition, Is This Tomorrow? And then after all this time, now that we've gone through from 1956 till now, we are again questioning, is this the tomorrow we were actually hoping for? So a few of the collaborations, it was 10 collaborations, and we were all invited to come together, one artist and one architect. So I worked with Rana Begum. She's a British artist born in Bangladesh, and we both worked together, and our idea was hope, that there is no point in losing hope. We should all be focusing on this idea of hope and not to lose it. Even though the world and all the atmosphere and everything that we hear these days do not give us a very bright future to look at, but we thought, the phoenix will rise. So this is our collaboration. The gallery is basically a very open, it's a very closed space. We tried to create a sort of a covered, enclosed space, and an oculus in the middle where Rana worked on. She works a lot with color and light. So she did a kind of a topography which was depicting a nice drum. And so this is the project, which is sort of depicting that idea.
Light of hope. It was important for us to create a space that was positive, that allowed people to kind of come together, feel that hope.
And this is now traveling to Dubai in Al Circle Avenue. This is by Remkulas, a concrete, a nice building, and in the courtyard, this is now being placed, and this is outside. So it's a small pavilion-like space. And once you enter, the oculus is now in the middle, and you can see the light coming in now. This is much more in the daylight. And I finish it here. Thank you so much for listening to me for so long. Thank you.
Está? Sim. Obrigado. Não, um pouquinho tarde, mas se há alguma pergunta, seja em inglês ou em português, a Marina amavelmente vai atender, vai responder. Well, yeah, good.
Okay, sure.
I think we should pass the mic. Hey.
Yes, a few thoughts. I'm not sure I'll remember, but I thought it was very important at the beginning when you showed us how architecture can adapt to a developing environment. Because these days, with climate change, more extreme climatic events, increased flooding, strong winds, I think we really have to think how architecture can adapt in the future to this changing environment, because there'll be some very special conditions to which architecture has to be prepared for. One other thing that concerns me is, and you were saying how densely populated your country is, and we know how densely populated the world is becoming, and how most of the population lives in the coastal areas. And with the increased flooding and with the rise of the sea level, maybe there's something we have to think about that, because a lot of architecture, a lot of our population will probably be more prone or to these climatic and extreme events. Something else that I was thinking of as I was watching your presentation, and I absolutely adored your work, is on the environmental impact. You were talking of a footprint, but on another sense, but on the ecological and even carbon or environmental footprint of buildings, and how you were using vernacular and traditional architecture, which I have an idea that sometimes if you look at the thermal qualities, and I thought it's brilliant how you work with light, but the thermal qualities of the buildings, sometimes when they use the local materials and traditional and local techniques, probably are much higher or better than some of the vernacular architecture. But in fact, in terms of the environmental footprint, sometimes, or the ecological footprint, we find that traditional architecture, by using the local materials locally sourced, have a much lower footprint than materials that we can source from thousands of miles away sometimes. So I don't know if you have any views on those particular topics.
There was no question. There's no question, though, is there? Yeah.
No, I mean, you're right. I agree absolutely. Locally sourced material, that's how people have always lived. Vernacular is about locally sourced materials, and they have been perfected over time. So people are used to that kind of environment, the way they live. I do agree that these corrugated sheet buildings tend to get heated up, but then they have a lot of openings. So, it's quite interesting. If you go to Sharjah, you'll find, I thought it would be really hot and people won't be able to stay inside. But from my own experience, now that we've built it there and we've been there a couple of days, it doesn't get hot, really. Because of the amount of openings it has, the breeze basically just flows in and out. So it's almost like a pavilion. So it doesn't really feel that hot. But in a local Bangladeshi context, when you have a house like that, it's generally shaded with trees. So there will be a lot of trees around your house. So the trees basically keep your house shaded, and it does not really feel very, very hot. And mud is definitely a material which, is perfect to build, because during the hot summer months, it's much more cooler when you're inside. And in the winter time, it's much more warmer than what you have outside. So in a way, in many ways, the fact that we've been living in air conditioning for all our lives has sort of conditioned us in a way that we are becoming much more intolerant to these differences. We have a specific temperature where we are comfortable, otherwise not. But in a country like Bangladesh, where we have lack of electricity, so these days it's much better now. But in the villages, there could be like power cut for 3-4 hours, and so people are much more used to being in a normal environment, and people really live their lives more outside than inside. So outside has, or maybe as I was mentioning, the courtyard is actually the main living space for people. So they're much more used to being in the nature than we are.
Are there any more questions now? I was wondering, Marina, I think to some extent when we think of materiality and materials, we tend to think about brick and stone and concrete and these sort of things. But looking at your work, I think it's also light and air are also construction materials in their own right. So I think it's precisely a combination of light. Of course, we were talking about Kant before and how light is the make of architecture in a sense, no? But how are these kind of invisible materials shaping or engaging in conversation with the physical ones, with both the physical but more the traditional materials? I don't know whether that's a question to answer, but anyway.
Yeah, I don't know. I have to think about that. But light and air is one of the main ingredients, like material is, right? We basically create, and I think atmosphere that we create in any architecture is built with light and the temperature, the material, the texture. All these things actually add up to create a memory of a space where we inhabit, right? So basically, for me, all these things are material rather than just being, the so-called materiality, or, Yeah, so I don't know if there is any answer to your question.
No, it's just like a short thought while we...
Yeah.
No.
Hello. I was in India some years ago, and I visited Chandigarh, and I visited the school, the architectural school, and the students were very marked by the presence of Le Corbusier. And they said, we are a little bit tired of listening about Le Corbusier. We even have a unit, a discipline called post-Corbusian architecture. And they showed us the projects they were doing, and they were not Le Corbusier, but they were like Middle East, glassed, Dubai architecture. And we were surprised by, but you have such a richness, legacy from modern movement adapted to the place, that why is this happening? And they say, well, because we keep listening about Le Corbusier and the presence for Le Corbusier. And when we look at your architecture, we feel the presence of Louis Kahn, of course. But what I like about it, it's you're trying to make Louis Kahn become Bangladesh architecture, because in a way the geometry is there, but the materials are coming from the sites, and the way you deal with the scale and the relation with the surroundings are much less monumental and abstract than Louis Kahn could have done. So in a way, is there a post-Louis Kahn architecture going on in Bangladesh, or you're still very satisfied about the example of this so important architect for your culture?
Well, Louis Kahn's presence is very powerful in Bangladesh. I mean, especially in the context of Dhaka, definitely, but overall in Bangladesh, especially architecture, yes. You know, when you become a student of architecture, that's the first building you go to. And, you know, in a way, it's a kind of a benchmark of architecture. And, you know, the Parliament building is considered one of the best buildings of, let's say, the 20th century. So in that sense, obviously, it has a certain presence. Kahn is not easy to copy. You can probably copy one or two punches here and there, but it's not Kahn, really. And many architects tried that and failed in many ways. To understand Kahn, I think it's much more important to understand the spaces, the way he thinks. To some extent, even reading his lectures, he was not much of a writer, but if you read his texts, to some extent, try to understand. And understanding Kahn, obviously his intention was always this timelessness and his interest in light, let's say, geometry, obviously, which, I don't know if I took it from Kahn or was it something that was within me. I won't be able to tell you, honestly. But obviously I am very much fascinated by his architecture. I've visited most of his buildings. Any chance I get, I do visit. It's not just to just to understand the mind of how it actually works. What was he thinking? Because I think the architect's reflection is his buildings. It's you never away from it. So whatever I build is a kind of a reflection or extension of me in many ways. So I try to understand that. And in terms of Bangladesh, I think because it's a benchmark in many ways, and also Mazharul Islam, who has a number of projects that are really uniquely beautiful. And then we also had Paul Rudolph, Stanley Tigerman. We had a couple of really, from that generation of, let's say, second generation modernists, let's say. We have a couple of good buildings. So that actually adds to the entire culture. But I think what you find quite unique in Bangladesh is the fact that people have been trying to create their own language of architecture, going beyond that. To some extent, glass is always there, obviously, though that's in many ways the product of the commodification of architecture. We are not far from that either, but from even then, I think there is a good amount of architects. Like if in the Bengal Stream exhibition, there's more than 30 architects, actually 33 architects, whose work is being presented. So you can imagine there is enough understanding of going beyond what has been produced already. So yeah, I think we've been able to go past that. Yes. Okay, I think everybody is
Yeah, I think everything is
hungry.
Everyone is hungry, and I think we should call it a session, not a day yet. So thank you so much, Marina.
Thank you so much for this invitation.